Hey everyone, so today we're back. We're going to be looking at a game between Akiba Rubinstein and Georg Salwe. I hope I'm saying his name right. This game was played in 1907 in Lodz. So Rubinstein was known for his very strong endgame play, but also at attacking isolated pawn weaknesses. So I want to show a game that is a perfect example of that. So Rubinstein started with one d4. He's playing the white pieces. His opponent, Georg Salwe, played d5, c4, e6, knight c3. This is all very standard. And here's c5, the Tarrasch variation. Nowadays, this isn't really played too much at the top level because people just try to go for something a little bit more ambitious. So here white took, black took back. Now knight f3, very simple development. Knight c6, and now bishop g5. And this was a move that Rubinstein played a lot during these years. He often switched between, I did not mean to go forward with the move, but he often switched between bishop g5 and bishop f4. Eventually he developed a system with g3, which has become a very common theory in this position. It's actually the main move. But anyways, bishop g5, just hitting the queen. Trying to provoke maybe a really bad move, f6. Just getting the bishop out. Bishop e7, black decides to exchange dark squared bishops. But I think this is actually exactly what white wants, because now he can just play e3. After castles, white simply took on c5. It just looks like a free pawn. Now, why not take here? You could, but then, d4 comes. So that's why he instead opted to play e3 first, just to prevent that advance. The goal is to really straddle black with an isolated pawn, but not allow black to get in d4 and then remove his own isolated pawn. Alright, so castles takes. So it looks like white won a pawn for nothing. This cannot be recaptured immediately. So queen a5 was played, trying to regain the pawn. There isn't really much of an alternative. You can try bishop g4 first, but queen a5 just to immediately try to regain the pawn. Bishop e2, normal development. And now queen takes. Here, white castled. Now, you can't play d4 here yet because this just loses material after e takes, obviously. So this is not really working yet, but black can prepare this by playing something like bishop f5 and bringing the rooks into the center via d8. Going rook d6, rook d8, and trying to push through d4. That's really black's whole idea here, is to try to remove this isolated pawn and activate his pieces, which are actually placed pretty well right now. Maybe the knight on e7 is a little bit awkward. So rook c1 was played, very simple, developing the final piece besides the rook on f1. The rook on c1 just looks at the queen. Black proceeds with rook a d8. The idea, again, is just to play rook d6, rook d8, and try to push this pawn through. So here Rubinstein played knight b5, which is a really good move. Basically just retaining control over the square, but also hitting the queen. He also had other alternatives. He didn't really have to play knight b5 immediately. He could have just played queen b3, which is a very annoying move to meet. If d4 is played in this case, now knight b5 is so much stronger because the pawn is going to fall. The queen is hit, and it doesn't really have a good place to go to. If something like queen b6, you can literally just take this and you just win a pawn. So if, let's say, black tries something else, let's say bishop e6, which looks reasonable, but then you lose the b7 pawn. So that's not really good. If you try something like queen b6, that just allows white to double the structure, and with a double pawn structure and an isolated pawn, it's a pretty hopeless endgame for black. Black can try to hold on, but it's going to be a very tough fight for him. Something like rook fd1, just preventing d4, and white is in very good shape. So he could have tried that, but he played knight b5, which is still a good move. Queen b6 was played. Queen d2. And now bishop e4. Now, black really needs to try and organize this knight somehow. He doesn't really want to go to g6 because it'll just be staring at nothing. He really wants to get this knight into f5, and maybe at some point he can exchange his bishop for knight, which would allow black to somehow gain control over the d4 square. So the knight came back to d4. This is very sensible. Now rook d6, this is a very common maneuver in these kind of structures. You really want to double up, try to push this pawn through, maybe even swing across to the king side somehow and create some problems there. And I'll give this move to you. You can try to guess what Rubinstein did here. So he played here rook c3, which is an excellent move. You just want to pile up on the c file. There's really no point to just play moves like rook d1 because everything's blocked here. So the only thing that's open is this c file. So rook c3 is an excellent move for two reasons. One, it obviously tries to control the c file. The other is that it tries to get in rook b3, which would attack b7. And, you know, if you look at it from here, like rook b3, he can't go queen c7 because of knight b5. So it starts looking really, really tricky. So that's why here black played rook g6. If black were to continue with something like this, which again looks really natural to just double the rooks, it doesn't work because of rook b3, and it's really hard for the black queen to find a square. Again, it can't go to c7 because of knight b5. So queen a5, for example, but you just lose b7. If you give up the a pawn, it doesn't really matter because of knight e5. Again, just trying to get rid of this knight here and then take on e7. You can see how that knight is actually really awkwardly placed. The rook on the 7th is a beautiful piece, and I mean, black just doesn't have a good response here. If this knight is taken, for example, then you just take. The knight is hit again. And if something like knight g6, you can just go back with rook b7 and then slowly pile up with moves like, you could try queen b8, queen b4. You could try moves like, just, you know, very calm, like rook c1. You could try to play f3. This bishop is also looking a little bit stranded. So, you know, it's not very easy for black to find a good move here. And there's really not a good alternative here. Like knight c4, for example, you can just take this and you, not this, sorry. You take this one first, and then you take this. And that just wins material, obviously. So it's not really easy for black to just play natural moves because he's going to be overwhelmed. So you can see how rook c3 is just all around a very useful move. So rook g6 was played. Now, if rook b3, it's a different story because now if rook b3, you can play queen c7 because after knight b5, he can just play like queen c8, queen d7, and he's fine here. The pawn is defended, and the knight's actually not doing anything. It probably should go back. So anyways, back to the game. So here g3 was played. This is just to g3. It looks like a weakening move, but actually it's a good move because in a lot of cases, black wants to take on d4, and white really wants to recapture with the knight. He doesn't want to capture with the pawn because it would not make sense to give yourself an isolated pawn without some sort of positional advantage. But he can't take with the knight because the bishop and the rook actually eye up the g2 pawn. So g3 was played. Now, it looks like the most obvious move here is rook fc1 instead of g3, for example. I just want to show you how this works. Like, for example, knight takes knight. Now, obviously, you can't take with the knight, so pawn takes, and this is just not ideal. The rooks, although they look great, it's actually not something that black can't deal with pretty easily. And now white has this weakness as well. You never know, black can also take on f3, and at some point maybe this d4 pawn is an actual serious weakness with like knight f5 coming at some point. Rook d8. Black can just play simple moves. The rook will come to c7, but, you know, I think black can just nullify that. So g3. And here, black decided to just take on f3, which I don't think was a good move. There's a really interesting concept here with rook h6. Now, if you see the idea, then you should probably pat yourself on the back. It's a pretty cool idea. The point is if something like rook fc1, black can play knight takes d4. And if knight takes d4, then rook takes h2 is a very strong move. I think this is very pretty. Obviously, this cannot be taken because of queen h6, and you get mated on h1. There's just no way to stop this. You can block, but it doesn't matter. So this is just a very interesting tactic with rook h6, and it actually prevents white from taking with the knight here. Rook takes h2 is just a very strong move. So I think that should have been a try, but again, it's actually hard to see why that's so good. But he took instead. So bishop takes. Note how he didn't take with the knight, which looks more natural, and even Stockfish likes it. But then you would have to contend with the idea of just d4 or rook d6. You honestly want the knight to just stay on d4. So I think bishop takes is a better move. Also, it covers the g2 square, so you can always put the bishop back on g2. It's a very good move. Knight takes d4. Now, you obviously don't want to exchange queens yet, so pawn takes. And it looks like white got nothing out of this. I mean, it's just an isolated pawn for both sides. So black played rook c6. But you'll see how white's pieces actually activate here beautifully. Rook e1 is a good move. Again, exploiting the fact that this knight is just very awkward. So what does black do? I mean, if black plays something like knight g6, for example, rook b3, stepping away from this exchange, and after, let's say, something like this, you can just take this pawn. So that's one thing. So that's not working. So what is he supposed to do? So black played here a really good move, queen b4, covering the knight and just trying to keep his queen a bit active. If something like a3, just queen d6, and black is worse, but it will take some work for white to convert this. If black were to exchange on c3, this is really not advisable because you just simply, you kind of fix white's structure in a way. This is a backwards pawn, but at least it's not an isolated pawn on d4. And white still has a nice light squared bishop. And the rook is still hitting e7. So it's really not that clear. I mean, you still can't even move that knight because d5 falls. So it's still a struggle for black to really equalize here. Queen b4 is the best try. And now rook e5, a very strong move, just hitting the pawn again. Notice how black can't really attack this pawn at all. If something like rook c4, you can play a3 first, and that just disrupts the coordination of the pieces. So for example, if something like, well, let's say if he tries to hold on to it, which isn't a good idea. This just loses because the knight hangs, so black's pieces are not coordinated enough to create any sort of counterplay. The knight on e7 is a real problem. So rook e6 was played. This is, again, the best try. So black is playing really well here. Now, this could just be taken. You can just take this. This is a totally acceptable way to play. I just don't think it's what Rubinstein had in mind. Now, queen e1 with the idea of playing rook e3, bishop g4, and trying to pile up on this backwards pawn. It's not a bad idea. The problem is I think black can actually hold this a bit better than how it turned out in the game. Like queen d6, and you could try rook e3. But after rook f6, it's kind of hard to figure out how to hurt black's structure here. I mean, after bishop g4, king f7, and again, you have to take some time to figure out how do I exploit this weakness on e6. So it's not so clear, and you did fix black's structure a little bit by taking away the isolated pawn. So taking is not what happened in the game. Instead, bishop takes d5 was played. Here, Rubinstein realized that the endgame for him is actually a lot better than just trying to cash in with rook takes e6 or playing some other move here. So after this exchange of pieces, b2 drops. But in return, white has an excellent queen, and he manages to get this move rook c7 in. There's really no good way to defend b7 because f7 is weak. So one way or another, one of these two pawns are going to fall. And you can notice how a2 is defended, the f pawn is pinned, and there's a pretty strong e pawn here. White has like a very nice center control with his pieces in the pawn. The rook is also beautifully placed, and notice how the move g3 is actually now very beneficial because there are no back rank issues. The king can just always hop to g2, and he's completely safe. So black decided to play b5 to give away the b pawn and in exchange, give away the a pawn and keep his b pawn in exchange. So rook takes a7. Again, there was really no way to prevent any of these pawns from dropping, so b5 makes sense. Rook takes a7, and now it is currently white with a pawn up, basically. The other thing white has as an advantage is an active rook and a very active queen and a good center point. So if white can keep this e-pawn alive and try to prevent it from getting pressured, white should be much better here. So h6, just to give the king an escape square. h4, again, just giving the king some more room, but also preventing g5 stuff. Pretty good move. B4, black tries to advance. King G2, very safe, just tucking the king away from the back rank so there are no checks. Notice how the queen is actually on the same diagonal as the king, so again, there are no checks. There's nothing this queen can do. The queen is very inactive. It just doesn't have a role in the game. And here King H8 was played, which I don't think was a great move. It was trying to unpin from F7, but I don't think this was a great idea. Now, it looks like you can just take this. But actually, after this exchange, he wins E5. And although white is a pawn up at the moment, there's really no way to actually convert that extra pawn here. I mean, white can play on for ages, but with the queens on the board, suddenly the black queen is active. It's really not a good idea to exchange the pawns. So that's why rook takes F7 was not played. It would just throw away the advantage, because this e-pawn is actually a very important piece in the position. So rook b7 instead is an excellent move. Again, the a2 pawn is defended. This queen is perfectly placed. He doesn't have to move it. The king is perfectly placed. So he just improves the rook. He attacks the b pawn while keeping it on the 7th rank. So queen c3, just stepping out of the line of the rook, but also trying to, in some way, activate it. So what black really wants to do here in his dream scenario is play queen e1, rook e8, and try to pick up this pawn. Again, that is a dream scenario because it's very hard to achieve here. Here Rubinstein played h5, which is a good move. He could have also tried queen e4, which is an even stronger move, just preventing queen e1. And that way there's no pressure on this pawn, and the queen is perfectly placed. And again, he could just obviously follow up with h5 eventually and just, try to steamroll black. A very strong position. I mean, black's queen is no good way to activate here. If you try, I mean, this pawn is also weak, so there's just nothing black can do here. He's going to lose the pawn. There's no active queen here, and there's no way to actually pressure this this pawn. So if something like this, then queen takes b4, and you can't even take this because the rook on f8 is hanging. That's why king h8 is probably not a good move, because the king was actually had a role on g8, which was to defend the rook. So black is in a lot of trouble here. But h5 was played anyways, which is still a good move. White is still in complete control here. Queen e1, rook e7, just preventing rook e8. Queen e2, trying to remain active, basically trying to pick up this a pawn, and look at the h pawn as well. And I'll give this move to you. What do you think Rubinstein did here? So queen f3 was played. This is a very nice move. Now, black just took this a pawn, but what happens if the queens are exchanged? Well, white has a very strong position here. Black can do nothing with this b pawn, because if it ever pushes forward, even if the rook was on b8 in some scenario, it will just be exchanged off, and white has an extra pawn. For example, something like king g8, you could play rook a7, rook b8, king g4. I mean, the rook on b8 is actually doing nothing. There's nothing the rook is doing. And this is very difficult for black to do anything. It's very difficult for black to untangle here. He's basically confided to the back rank with his king. The king cannot really cross the 7th rank. This pawn cannot be pushed forward. And white just has to push his f-pawn, bring his king in, push the g-pawn, and start breaking through on the king's side, and he's completely won. Black can really just wait here. He can't really do anything that would improve his position. So going back here. So yeah, queen takes would just lead to a very, very difficult endgame for black. So queen takes a2, tries to hold something in the position, tries to somehow create a passer. Now Rubinstein allowed this with the point of playing e6 because this is a pin. So black here played b3. You could probably see the eval bar go up. I want to give this move to you again. You tell me, how would you play on? There are multiple ways to win here. So I'll just say the move now. Rubinstein played probably the most beautiful move in the position that's available, which is queen takes f7. That is just very beautiful. Sacking his queen, and there's really no way that black can take this. There's just nothing black can do here. Now, what happens if instead of b3, let's say something like f6? Now, actually, I want to show what happens with queen takes f7. If this is taken, then e takes, and there's no way to stop this queen. Like rook e8 is coming or f8 is coming. There's just nothing to do. You could try checks, but it doesn't really do anything. I think even king h2 is just good here, but king g1, let's say another check, and after the king comes to h2, there's nothing to do. b2, okay, we queen, and then we mate. So there's no way to stop it. If instead of queen a1, if b2 here, for example, then just rook e8, and you can just take, and after queening, again, king h2, there are no checks on the light squares. The king is very safe on h2. He's very well protected. There's no way to stop this queen. There's nothing to do here. Even queen e1 doesn't work, trying to attack f2, because the queen comes and it defends f2 and mate is threatened. So none of this is working. So you can't actually take this queen. It's just a poison queen. So queen a8 was played. King h2, very sensible, just stepping out of any checks on the back rank, and the king is completely secure here. Black can really do nothing. Rook g8. Again, this cannot be taken because same idea. If you try anything with this, just rook e8, and we get the same variation as before. So rook g8 was played, trying to avoid this, and also defend from mate, obviously. Now, a very strong move here. How does white proceed? I mean, white looks like he's just completely winning. Great move. Rook b7, just perfect. Covering the b pawn, so it prevents counterplay. Blocking this diagonal, and preparing to play e7. What a good move. That's just a great move. And here black really doesn't have any moves. I mean, what do you play? He tried to exchange queens here, but it's completely hopeless. Queen f5 was played. You could also I think you could even just exchange queens. You could even just take this pawn. After this, if rook f8, you could just play rook b7, and then bring the king up slowly, and black can just sit and do nothing. He's just going to lose. That's a very brutal way of doing it. But queen f5, just keeping the queens on. Queen a4. He's trying to keep his queen active by playing moves like queen a2, queen c4. But it's just nothing. This pawn is too far advanced. This king is doing nothing, and the rook is very passive. And this rook is beautiful. This queen is amazing. Black is completely lost here. Queen f3 is a good move. Just once again, covering this diagonal. You don't really want to allow stuff like queen c6. Just a very strong move, looking at the b pawn. There's just nothing black can do to basically create any sort of counterplay here. Rook e8 was tried. e7. This is pretty simple. King h7. Queen f8. Again, it can't be taken because white just queens. Queen c6. Rook b8. And there's really no good way to actually stop this pawn from promoting, but we don't want to promote yet because that would lead to problems. So white just took here. Now there's no good way for black to try and take this pawn or stop it from queening. Black tried queen e4 to remain active. Queen a3 is a good move, just defending the pawn. Also looking at f3, so it's just really difficult for black to find anything here. So queen e2 was tried. Great move, just covering f2. And covering this pawn as well. No counterplay. Queen e3 offering a queen exchange. The h pawn was dropped, but it doesn't matter because there's nothing that black can do here. Again, white offers a queen exchange. Plays queen c6, threatening e8 queen. And black here resigned. There's really nothing to do here. There's no way to stop the queening of this pawn. Again, the queen on this diagonal is beautiful because the queen cannot check. And there's just no way to actually do anything here. So, what a game. I just want to go back to some key moments in the game here. So, right around in this position, knight b5 is a good move. Very important to try and control the d4 square. Prevent black from getting in d4 himself. So a really good move. And then just playing queen d2. Not playing knight d4 first because b2 would drop. I think I forgot to mention that. And just trying to hold on to his, I would say, positional advantage of not having an isolated pawn. Rook c3 is another key move in the game. This is an excellent move. Just preparing rook b3, preparing rook c1. Notice how he didn't play any natural moves. Like, how many of us would just play rook d1 here? You know, how many of us would just play something like a3? I mean, there are so many ways to play here, and he picked the best way, I believe. Like, I think this is the best way to play, which is just rook c3, going rook c1 at some point. Rook b3 is a threat. So anyways, yeah, and then, you know, deciding to take with the bishop here instead of the knight is another key move. And although he accepted the isolated pawn himself, his pieces were just far more active, and you can see how black's knight on e7 is very poor. Queen b4. Maybe I forgot to mention, no, I didn't. I looked at knight g6. Queen b4, rook e5, again, a great move, just targeting that pawn, and then deciding to exchange like this into a better endgame. Giving up the b2 pawn, but in exchange he gets a very active rook, and he's going to win the pawn back anyways, and the pawn on e5 is excellent. Just understanding that that position would arise from here, like after taking here, that this position was possible. I do want to briefly mention something, which is instead of taking this, if he would have done something like knight takes d5, let's say, black still has a very bad position here. This is extremely bad because the rook will still come into c7. The rook will actually come into d7. This pawn is still very strong, although it's isolated. Again, white is just a pawn up with active rooks, and I mean, you could try queen e7 to prevent rook c7, for example, but now rook e3. I feel like I forgot to mention this. And if this is taken, you just offer a queen exchange, and this cannot be taken because two of these pawns with the rook being active is just a win for white. Rook d7 will come, and the pawn will slowly push forward. Pretty simple win. But that was just an example. But just understanding that after bishop takes d5 and after all these exchanges, white ends up in a good endgame here. I think that's the key thing to understand. Like, you could be up a pawn, but you have to get a good endgame out of it. Really good understanding. And then playing all these moves, just understanding that he doesn't have to move the queen. He doesn't have to move the rook. He just has to keep everything in control and just try not to relinquish that control that he has over the position. He didn't make any risky moves. He didn't go pawn grabbing. He just simply played very, very controlling chess. It kind of reminds me of like Carlsen. So rook b7 was another great move. Just improving his position little by little and making black's task harder and harder. And here, just offering this queen exchange is another sign of his amazing understanding that, you know, the position is just much better for him. And then finding this nice move, queen takes f7. I think that was the final key move of the game. I think the rest was just cleanup for him. So yeah, what a game. I will be continuing this series, so thank you so much for watching. I do this because I like to do it. So yeah, feel free to leave feedback, comments. You could sub if you want. Leave a like. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with more.